This program has been made possible by the generous support of these organizations at Stanford University: Office of the Provost, Institute for International Studies, School of Humanities and Sciences, and Ambassador and Mrs. L.W. Lane, Jr., Donald L. Lucas, the Russell Family Foundation, Ronald P. Spogli. International Environmental Politics was offered to students at Stanford University as part of the International Policy Studies program during Winter Quarter 2001.
Today, want to switch. We're sort of switching modes. We talked over the last couple times about the role of NGOs, the role of other actors in kind of identifying problems, and then last time talked about scientific communities and just sort of how we identify problems in general, identify international environmental problems in general. Now I want to switch to, okay, so now we know there's some problems out there. How do, and this we're going to switch really into kind of the regime's mode. You see that in Breitmeyer's piece for today. We're going to switch to thinking specifically about how do states come to some sort of negotiated solution to these things. And I want to start by, we'll go through Sprins and von Aranta's article in some detail to kind of try to draw that out as a nice and elegant but simple model of why states come to the positions they do, and then talk about the process. But I want to start by getting you thinking about negotiations, negotiating solutions to environmental problems. Why do we need negotiations? I mean, what's the general purpose of negotiations? Okay, come to an agreement between two parties who have different views. Okay, right. Multiple parties who have different views. Fair enough. Okay, and then what? I mean, going back to PS 35 and thinking about how our theories of international relations. What should be your or what are some alternative theories about what we should expect to happen in those cases? You get 5 countries together, or you get 150 countries together, and they all agree to reduce CO2 emissions, or acid precipitant emissions, or mercury going into the North Sea, or whatever it is, right? So what are our basic theories about this?
A realist would say that it would have happened anyway. Whatever comes out of the treaty, if they all lower their emissions, then it might have happened. It probably would have happened anyway. It didn't have anything to do with the treaty.
Okay. So, but even before, so why do you, so if states know that, why negotiate in the first place? There was if, okay, for public relations, domestic audiences, okay. Other kind of expansions on what Kari is pointing out? So I mean, do negotiations look weird? Do they seem unusual? Sarah?
I think the one thing about negotiations is that it's like all the states want to act in their best interest, we could say.
Mm-hmm. In their own best interest.
In their own
self-interestedly.
Yeah,
mm-hmm.
they want to act in their self-interest, but it's sort of like to defeat the tragedy of the commons problem.
Okay.
Like, they want to act in their own self-interest, and but it's like if the other guy doesn't have any rules, like they want to set a pace, like so that there are enough seals next year to harvest or whatever. So.
Okay.
it's like they want to do that, but if the other guy is going to go out and get all the seals, they want to get all the seals too. But so it's in their best interest to like negotiate.
Okay.
Sort of like the prisoner's dilemma, even.
Okay. Okay, good. So, I mean, one, it is that we see negotiations a lot of times to solve PD or tragedy of the commons type problems, right? Okay, Kim, on this?
Well, it is states a way to hold other ones accountable, so that, you know,
Okay.
in the absence of an agreement, if another state does whatever it wants to do, then you can't really do anything about it. But if they signed an agreement, you know,
What can you do?
in some form, you can use the pressure of the rest of the states in the agreement
Okay.
to kind of pressure them and hold them accountable, which may or may not work, but it is a tactic.
Okay. So, I mean, I think this is an important part, is that you want to think about tactics that may work, they may not too. But I think, so one of the things it does is think about one of the things that negotiations do when you come to an agreement, right? I mean, it is this process of trying to come to agreement. It stems often, I mean, the generic version of what Sarah was saying is to say states look at what happens when they act individually, right? I mean, to go back to the basic definition of cooperation, if cooperation is when, no, I'm trying to dredge it up from my memory. Cooperation is good outcomes from interdependent decision making, right? If we have good outcomes that just happen from us independently acting the way we do, then you know, independently pursuing our interests, right? Then that's just harmony, and there's nothing really unusual to explain. That's like, you know, if we see two states that both that keep a river clear because none of them have industries along that, you know, there's no reason, because the river is a very deep valley and there's no reason to have industries right alongside of that river, right? Then we're not surprised that the river stays clear. What we're surprised by is if there's a bunch of industries right on the river and the river stays clear through some cooperative process, right? So we have to believe that absent the treaty, they would have continued polluting. And in fact, what happens is you see states and they say, hey, we're polluting this river too much. We're killing too many seals. We're taking too much fish out of the ocean. We're doing this. And when we don't coordinate our behavior, we get bad outcomes. And so what we want to try to do is coordinate our behavior, okay? So that's the first step, is the sense of saying, okay, so how do we create some rules to coordinate our behavior? Then the question is, how do we then enforce it? What's the process of enforcing it? But since we see down the road that we might have to enforce it, that we will be held accountable. Whether it's a powerful accounting is another question altogether, but we will be held accountable. And notice how part of what happens when you create rules, right? Imagine this country before speed limits, right? Or imagine, actually imagine what it's like to be a producer of chemicals for refrigeration in 1970 and 1980. What's it like? What are you labeled as in 1970 and 1980 if you produce the chemicals, the CFCs and all that stuff that are used as refrigerants? You're labeled as a good, you know, as a Fortune 500 company is what you're labeled as, right? I mean, you're a big company that produces good things that help, you know, help people live good lives, right? That refrigerate food so that people, you know, in the developing world can have cheap refrigerators so that 70% of their food doesn't go bad before 2 days, right? Saves lives, right? I mean, if you want to frame it that way. What happens as soon as you have the Montreal Protocol? You've got a behavior that before was sort of flat, right? is now unlevel, right? Those who produce CFCs and those who don't. And those who produce CFCs are bad guys, and those who, you know, don't produce them are good guys, right? Just like with, you know, with a traffic law. Before there's a traffic law, you're just driving. You're not speeding or not speeding because there's no notion of speeding, right? But you're just driving. You know, that we are, through this process of creating regimes, creating green states and brown states, right? We're socially constructing some notions about what it means to be a green state. Eli, we're just scratching your head. Okay. Okay, so what some of the questions we want to ask is, why do states take the positions they do, and then why do states succeed in negotiating when those positions are different, like when they have alternative and competing views about what the world should be like. And I think just a couple things. I'm going to change the organization of the lecture a bit, but I'll get through all the parts. But I think an important part in environmental, kind of distinguishing environmental problems in environmental negotiations from other negotiations, is that in most environmental negotiations you're allocating sacrifices. You're saying we have to give up something today to get something tomorrow. And that, so you've got to incur a cost today for some future stream of benefits, environmental or otherwise, downstream. And that's much less the case in other arenas, right? That in arms control, it's a risk. It's certainly a risk to engage in an arms control agreement where Mark and I both agree to give up our weapons. But the benefits are immediate, right? I immediately see that he's giving up his weapons, and I am therefore more secure. Immediately. I don't have to wait 10 years to see, did those weapons, you know, did the elimination of those weapons benefit me? I know right away that the elimination of it, when I see the Russians cutting up nuclear missiles, I know it's a good thing for me, and it's a good thing right now to have them cutting up missiles. It may take a while for it to kick in, but the benefits of the behavior are immediate. Same with free trade. You lower tariffs, my goods get in. You know, it's in a reciprocal benefit, right? In order to get you to lower your tariffs, I have to lower mine. So there is a cost, but there's a counterbalancing benefit that is in the immediate or relatively short term. In the environmental stuff, all we're doing is saying we want to give benefits to future generations, right? They may be our generation, but 5 years from now, right? But it may take us 5 years to get the Rhine clean enough, right? But the benefits are not going to be immediate. They're also going to be equally important. They're going to be dispersed, right? They're going to be dispersed over a large group of people, and you know, and often not the government, and often not the empowered people. I mean, go back to the environmental justice kind of stuff we were talking about last time. If you clean up a river, there's lots of people who are going to be benefit who aren't going to vote for you because they have lived near a cleaner river, right? So you have this distributed benefits, future benefits, and yet present and very concentrated costs. You have to, so think about the ozone debate, right? Imposing a lot of costs on very concentrated and powerful industries, right? I mean, there were basically, I don't know, something like 7 CFC major, you know, there were 7 companies that produced something like 60, 70, 80% of the CFCs in the world. You know, one, just DuPont, produced 25% of all world CFCs. So it's a very, and do you think DuPont had major power in the U.S. Senate, U.S. Congress, U.S. executive branch? Sure, right? I mean, that all this stuff you're hearing about campaign financing, they're on that list. You can look, I'm sure. You could look at the Federal Election Commission's listings of who gave money, and I'm sure DuPont's on almost every one, right? You could probably find DuPont funding almost every single senator and congressperson and executive person, right? So that there's a lot of money being given to government to say, don't impose costs on us, right? And yet, this was saying, no, you've got to change your whole marketing strategy. You have to change the whole way you do business. And who was going to benefit from getting rid of CFCs? A bunch of people down in Australia, New Zealand, right? The environment, perhaps, but not Americans very much, right? So it's this allocating sacrifice, and that's a lot harder, right? I mean, it's always easier. You know, think about these debates over, over the American budget, right? The American, the budget, budget for the United States. We're talking about this surplus. Is there really a surplus? No, we have more, I mean, in kind of financial terms, we have more, we have bigger income than our expenditures this year, but we still got, $1 trillion on our debit card, or on our credit card that we still owe, right? We still have the national debt, but we're not worried about paying off that national debt. That's fine to let our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren pay off that national debt, right? So that we can get a tax break this year, right? In fact, we're going to continue to push costs out on them to get a benefit. So we're going to take money from our future generations by providing ourselves with a tax cut this year, right? So, and that very model, of distributing costs and benefits is what infuses this, wait, why should I incur costs to benefit people I don't know in some future generation? That's the kind of issue. So it's really difficult, a difficult problem. So let's talk then let's look at Sprinzivana-Rana's sort of argument and why states take the positions they do. So let's look at the ozone case. I mean, he looked at the ozone case and the acid rain case, right? Okay, so what's the basic model? Anybody, help me put the basic model.
They basically say that it's an interest-based approach. Countries make decisions based on one, the cost of pollution abatement to them, and the cost of the problem to them.
Okay.
And depending on that, they go in 4 categories. Pushers, bystanders, draggers, or intermediates.
Okay.
And
so help me set it up in a nice little matrix.
So you have low cost to abate and high cost to abate. That would be.
Okay. Is this the columns or the rows?
Either one, I forget.
Okay. So we'll see if we can set it up ourselves without. So abatement costs.
Yeah.
Okay. Everybody's clear on what abatement costs are, right? How much it costs you to stop the problem? Okay. And they can be either low or high. Okay, and let's just start there. Let's take it slow, kind of on average, if this is low to high, going in this direction, in general, which do we expect to be, is low abatement cost supportive or opposing regulation on average? Okay, so supportive, these are supportive, and these are opposing in a sort of continuum along this direction, right? Okay. Okay. So what's the other one, Malka?
The economic cost, the cost of the issue.
Okay.
How the pollution is going to affect them.
Okay. What's their term for that?
Ecological vulnerability.
Okay. Right. Jennifer. Eco-vulnerability. They have nice, sophisticated categories for that too, right, Jennifer? What are they?
High and low.
High and low, right? Okay. So, and then let's do the same thing in a kind of in a spectrum sense, right? What's the support oppose?
High would be supportive and low would be opposing.
Okay, so that if you're very vulnerable to it, if you think you're going to get hit by this thing bad, you'll be supportive, and if not, you'll oppose. So let's, and I don't think they deal with this one. Maybe they do. Do they have Australia in their analysis? They do. Okay. So, but let's just walk through whether we can sort of, again, this goes back to this issue, and I'll walk through this in a second, but this is, how much, well, let's just predict. Where's Australia in this? For starters, what's the easy one for Australia to do? I mean, we know that which is easier, abatement costs or eco-vulnerability, based on Australia. Which is easier to know? Eco-vulnerability, right? And we know that their vulnerability is high, right? So we would expect them to be supportive, right? What about in terms of their abatement costs?
They were high too.
Were they high? Is that what Sprinzivana-Rana say? I mean, I'm not questioning it. I didn't reread it.
No, they were low. Sorry.
Okay, so they have low abatement costs. That it doesn't cost them much to abate. So we would expect Australia to be here. Now, just to go back, because I want you to be thinking about this as you do your papers. What's the model here? What's the dependent variable?
Level
support.
Okay, level support, Eli? Okay, level support of what? You keep repeating people, man. Always coming in after. No, so what, this level support of what?
Of whether or not to abate, yes. Or, yeah, support the negotiations.
Okay, support the negotiations, their position in the negotiations, right? So we're predicting their position in the negotiations. Have we think about this process. So we've got a theory, right? We've laid out a theory of abatement costs and vulnerability. that predicts your position in a negotiation, right? So our dependent variable is the position in the negotiation. How would evaluate their position in, okay, so we just made a prediction. How are we going to evaluate whether, and okay, so we also have names. In other words, they use these to create 4 names. So what are the names? So low abatement costs. Well, these should be the pushers, right? These should be the pushers because they're supportive for 2 reasons. Presumably, these should be the draggers, right? The people who oppose for a variety of reasons. And I always have a little trouble with this bystanders and intermediates. They say, you know, pick 2 English language words which mean almost nothing, right? And then assign them randomly to one or the other box here. I don't know. So does somebody else feel like they can explain why one's bystanders and one's intermediates? I mean, presumably, bystanders are people who don't care that much, right? They're kind of indifferent, whereas intermediates are on the fence, right? Intermediates are kind of, they're pulled 2 ways. So what would that be? Again, I think about this trying to think in terms of, can I recreate their argument? Rather than going back and reading it, right? It's just like, do I understand the logic of their argument well enough to recreate it? And so let's test how compelling their theory is to see if we can recreate it. So somebody help me out here. How do we? Okay, so a bystander is someone who doesn't care, right? Eli.
So wouldn't that be where their eco-vulnerability is low and their abatement costs are low?
Eco-vulnerability low. So this is a bystander. Why? So to explain the story there.
I was saying because it doesn't matter, like they're not affected that much, and if they have to abate, it doesn't cost that much anyway.
Okay, so they're kind of indifferent. They won't even show up for the negotiation in a sense. Okay, you guys want to do something, fine. If you want us to do it too, tell us at the end. It won't be that big. Okay, so that makes sense. So bystanders are up here, and then Eli, what's the corresponding argument for the intermediates?
Well, since their eco-vulnerability side, they have more to lose, but their abatement costs are higher, so they're sort of on the fence.
Okay. And so actually, so take that, somebody build on what Eli just laid out. Take the next step. So with an intermediate, what do you think, could we say more than that they're intermediates? Can we kind of project or predict what their position would be? What would, you're the delegate from country intermediate, whatever, you know, some intermediate country. What does your position look like? It's got 2 parts, right? And what do they look like?
It's probably being torn apart by domestic politics.
Okay.
Depending on who's in power or in the state itself.
Okay, torn apart by domestic politics between which groups?
The pro-environmental and the pro-industrial.
Right, so the environmentalists are saying do something about it, and the industrialists are saying we don't care if you do something about it, just don't make us pay, right? Okay, so what does that translate into when they're going into the negotiations? Well, what positions are they pushing?
They'll probably push for other countries to reduce rather than themselves.
Right. Let's do a lot and let you guys do it all, right? Okay, and that, so can you think of what's an example of something like that, of a country like that in, you know, it doesn't have to be in any of the ones we've looked at, just make, you know, or look at something you kind of think of, oh, that explains why that country's doing that.
Climate change with the United States.
Okay, climate change, the U.S. Tell the story.
Well, it's trying to push developing countries to also reduce their emissions when the industrialized countries are so much more responsible for emissions.
Okay, so we think we're going to benefit from it, you know, that is, if we can avoid it, we're vulnerable to climate change, but we face really high costs. So we're doing this intermediate stuff. Okay, good. So this is, I mean, this is a good way to work it through. Okay, and so where does Europe show up on that? Europe an intermediate too, or?
I would say it's in the intermediate position, but it's not acting as an intermediate.
Okay. Meaning, okay, it was so good. So what do you mean by that?
I don't think that Europe's hedging as much as the United States is when it's willing to take more responsibility, even if there are high costs.
Okay. And notice the difficulty here. What's Henke doing? Like, especially in the U.S. case. What did she do? What did she know? What fact did she know? And then what facts did we impute here? Did she know the independent variables and predict the dependent variable, or did she know the dependent variable and impute the independent variables? Which did she do?
Dependent variable.
She knew the dependent variable, right? She knows what the U.S. position on climate change is. And she imputed, right? Or inferred, I never can keep those straight, but one of those two things. She guessed at what these were, right? What's the problem with that, theoretically? Not to pick on Hanky, but what's the problem with it? What's the problem with predicting or kind of inferring? You want to test the theory, right? And so you go out and look at the dependent variable and infer and you know what the value of the dependent variable is. They are kind of intermediate with respect to the negotiations. And we infer the independent variables, right? The values of the independent variables. What's the problem with that?
You didn't check for the other 3 cases.
Yes, that's true. I mean, one would be we want to check the other cases, but forget that. There's a problem even with just checking this one case.
You don't know if there's another independent variable that ends up with the same.
You don't know there's another independent variable. What else?
That
Eli?
ends up with the same independent variable.
Okay, you don't know if there'd be other independent variables that would end up with the same dependent variable. That's good.
I'm just saying, usually if you just do it that way, you're always going to find what you're looking for.
Very good.
So you should.
Because you never checked independently, right? That there's no way if we only check, essentially we want to find 3 things, right? So let's take this. And this is the way I would urge you to really set up your whole case, your whole paper this way. That you should all draw a chart like this, okay? First of all, how many independent variables are there here? 2, right? Not 1, so we've already got a more complex world. Or, what could you also say? There's 1 independent variable with what? 4 values, right? It's sort of these are the 4 values, right? But let's set it up as the way they have. We won't have 5 cases, but we might. At least theoretically, this is how you want to set up your things. To say, we've got eco-vulnerability, abatement costs, then we're going to predict the dependent variable, then we're going to look at the observed dependent variable and see how it matches, right? And so what we're going to do is we're going to first say, so the first step is to fill in the theory. Okay, and actually, why don't I get out of this? Okay, we've only got 4 cases. So fill in the theory. The theory says, right? I mean, if any of you who know permutations, combinations, all that stuff from math, right? So we got 2 variables, each of which has 2 values. So we're going to have 4 options, right? So we can be, ecological vulnerability can either be high or low. And then we're going to have abatement costs can be high or low as well. Have we got all 4 combinations? Yes. Right, and we can even put names on these. So high is what? This is intermediates. This one is bystanders. High abatement costs. And low vulnerability is draggers and pushers, right? Okay? So we can predict that. Wait, so I just went through that way too fast for myself. So this is intermediate. This is bystander. This is draggers are high abatement costs, right? And these are pushers, right? Now, okay, so we now have our theory laid out in this framework, right? Just a different way of putting the same thing. We've got a theoretical framework. Then how do we test our theory? What we want to do is pick cases. We want to pick cases almost without reference to this, right? Pick cases based on our independent variables. Okay? Pick cases that make sure that we cover these 4, right? Okay? So we're going to pick cases, and if you didn't know what the dependent variable I was trying to predict was, how would you measure ecological vulnerability? I mean, Henke measured it by saying, well, I know what their position was, what's their, and then I'll just infer their abatement costs, right, and their ecological vulnerability. But if I said, go out and measure ecological vulnerability to climate change, what would you measure? Right? So it's a harder problem, right? To say, oh, God, I have to figure out, independent of anything else, just what's their ecological vulnerability to climate change? So Eli, you got an idea?
I was just saying maybe the sort of the coastal countries like Bangladesh might have a higher one if you're looking at just sea level rise.
Okay, so one metric would be to be susceptibility to sea level rise, and what we can do is go get some nice maps from the USGS and figure out what percentage of your country is below 10 meters above sea level or whatever, or 5 or whatever, right, that number is. We go to the, so that'd be a nice easy thing. You could measure it pretty quickly, right? What's the problem with that? I mean, it's great, but there's at least one problem with it, which is what?
The countries might not be aware of their own.
Okay, one is the countries might not be aware of that fact, and we have to believe for this theory to work that their positions are driven by their awareness of something, and if they're not aware of it, then their positions by definition can't. We have to know what the causal chain is by which this fact influenced the policy debate in that country. Okay, Eli?
Oh, Cardi.
I was going to say you've got some nations that have much more economic possibilities to change the result of.
Okay.
You got Holland versus like.
Right. You have people who've been building dikes for hundreds of years. They know how to build dikes. They just throw a few more sandbags on top of the dikes, and they're good to go, right? Or just have a lot more money to do it. Okay. So one option is, so we want to say ecological vulnerability is not merely the kind of, actually to go back to the to sort of Nye and Cohan's notion of sensitivity and vulnerability. They're sensitive to it. If they don't respond, they'll get flooded. But they're not vulnerable because they can respond. They have the capability to respond. Okay, Eli?
I was just going to say maybe just like land below a certain point might not be a good measure because that might have different, I guess, might be different populations on that land in different countries. So.
Okay. So if you have a country where you've got a lot of land, coastal land, but nobody lives on it, which tends to be rare, actually, right? I mean, if you look at the populations of the world, they're all located close to the ocean, to water. But still, it'd be something you want to investigate. But the big problem is that's not the only problem with climate change, right? If sea level rise was the only effect of climate change, that would be one thing. But we're not capturing everything, right? This is like taking an SAT score to say how intelligent somebody is. Well, we know that measures only a very limited fraction of what we mean, what we want to capture, what even anybody wants to capture by intelligence. Even people have a very limited notion of what intelligence means, who don't include music and art and a bunch of other things in it, physical intelligence. People who don't include that, who just mean intelligence, even they would accept that SATs don't measure what they want to get at, right? So one of the problems is that the concepts we want to measure are things like ecological vulnerability. But that, you need 500 different parameters for all countries over long periods of time. So you have to understand all this stuff for each one about how both their vulnerability in terms of how sensitive they are, but also how they can respond to it and their technological capability. So trying to capture all that is way hard. But notice that the good thing we're doing is, in thinking about, going to the USGS, is we haven't looked at the negotiations. So we don't fall into the trap. And I think what Henke was doing is what everybody does. That is, you look at your dependent variable, infer or impute your independent variables, and say, look, my theory worked. Right? If I want to say intelligent people get A's in my class, and then I say, look, here's the people with A's in my class. See, they're the intelligent people. No, I have to independently measure the intelligent people by some other metric that's not performance in the class to be able to say whether smart people did well in my class or not, right? So you want to measure this independently. Same with abatement costs. How do Sprins and Von Arana do this? Because one of the nice things, it's an extremely simplistic argument. And this is some of the best work out there, too. So it's a very simplistic argument, but what's nice about it is they do it right. They don't make it complex enough, but the parts they do are the right way to do it. So what do they do? What's the equivalent of sea level rise for them in the in the ozone case? How do they measure ecological vulnerability? Yeah, skin cancer rates, right? And who knows where they got that data, but they found some data on skin cancer rates. Is that a really bad metric? Yeah. What's its virtue? A, it's available. That's always a virtue, right? You can get it. And B, what's its other main virtue? Unrelated to position in negotiations, right? There's no way that skin cancer rates can be the effect of your position in the negotiation, right? It may be the cause of it, that's what we're trying to test, but it can't be the effect of it. The causal relationship cannot go the other way. The more you get involved in negotiations, the higher the rate of skin cancer among your population. That can't work, right? Lots of problems it can. Lots of times causal relationships can go both ways, right? So you have skin cancer rates. What about in the acid rain case? What do they use as their metric of vulnerability? It's degree exceeding critical load of acidity, right? Now, here's another problem, right? And it goes to what Malika raised, which is, did the publics and the policymakers know these facts, and could they be influencing it? Or are these just proxies, that try to capture that people know it, even if they don't know it specifically, they have some vague sense of how vulnerable they are. That the press plays up, the press, in Australia had played up the whole ozone hole problem a lot, had talked about these different strategies for protecting yourself from the sun. People in Australia were very aware of the problem, much more aware than Americans were about it. So, you can tell a little causal story about how that happened. Okay, so now we have predictions of, so we get this data. Oh, what about abatement costs? How do they deal with abatement costs? So in ozone, they use the intensity of CFC use. And in acid rain, they have an estimated cost of a 30% reduction. So it's a technological cost, the cost of changing behavior. So now you've got these, and you should be able to take their charts and put every country in these cases. And they do that. They do it in a different way, but that's what they do. So they have cases like this. They now have predictions, and now we should compare. Then we compare, okay, now we look at the negotiation record and see what were states' positions. And there, what's the problem there? What do you think? Okay, so now you're back over in Green Library. During your research, you've done this whole setup. You had whatever your variables were for your case. And now you're trying to predict, and you've predicted your dependent variable. Now you've got to observe your dependent variable. What's the difficulty? So we now look at the whole negotiation record for Belgium. What's the problem? So I don't know. Does anybody have the chart open from Sprins and Monterano's paper right here that lays it out for one of the two cases? So we know what their abatement cost is. What's their prediction? Jennifer, do you know?
For this is the transboundary certification.
Yeah. Okay. So for acid rain.
For the low lows, Finland, Ireland, Spain.
For the low is okay. Finland is one of them.
Finland, Ireland, Portugal, and Spain.
Okay, so we'll just say Finland. Okay, so we now know we have and that's the prediction, right? Now what's the problem? So we went to Finland and we looked at what their skin cancer. This is acid rain, no, but their critical loads were, right? We looked at their cost of a 30% reduction. We predict that they're a bystander based on that. Now, what's the next research task?
To examine other factors.
Okay, we would have to do that, but we're going to assume there are no other factors. It's a very simple world. Okay, so what's the next part? We've predicted that they're bystanders. What's the next part we got to do?
Find out what they did.
Find out what they did. Go read the negotiation record, right? And where's the problem there?
They were one of the first to.
What?
They were one of the first countries to push the agenda into the open.
Okay. But, okay, so that's the beginnings of a thing, but what's the kind of generic problem here? What's the problem you're going to face if we had a bunch of countries, all these countries laid out here the way they do? What's the problem? So you now do that. You've got this list up to here, and you've got that list like that with all the countries, right? And you've got the negotiation records piled high on your desk, and you've got to sit down and read in order to test your theory. What's the problem?
How are you going to assign them into, how are you going to put them into those 14?
How do you categorize? So you have a bunch of text of Belgium speaking, right? So you have a research assistant go through and retype all the Belgium statements throughout the whole thing, right? So you now have a document that's all of Belgium statements. You got to know, is Belgium different than Finland? Where are the lines? We're going to divide lines in text. We're going to take text, about what people said and decide where to put them. It's hard to do, but that is the process you're going to do, and the only way to do it is to do it explicitly and to say if they did, if they put a proposal for a 30% reduction on the table before date X, that constitutes being a pusher. That's what we're going to do, right? It doesn't matter. As long as you're explicit, then I can say, no, the better way to do it is before date Y. Or it should have been put at 10% or above proposal or whatever, right? But that's the process you have to go through, is this way of how you have to define these terms in operational terms in ways that you can actually get at it, okay? So I just wanted to kind of get this out there because this is what they do. They do a good job of it. Not perfect, but they do a pretty good job of it. And that's what you've got to do in your own stuff. And some of it, you've got, did it work or not, and we've got a pretty easy definition of that. But for some of your independent variables, you're going to have categories, and you have to be able to say, here's how I define these the different values on my independent variable. I think indigenous culture, countries that have not slaughtered their indigenous cultures comply with treaties better than those who do, right? And then you have to say, well, what does it mean to slaughter an indigenous culture? Have we slaughtered the American Indians? Well, depends how much slaughtering constitutes slaughtering, right? There are still some Native Americans around, and there's other countries in which the indigenous population are completely gone. How do you draw lines between these categories? That we're always doing that, but you have to think about it clearly. Okay, so getting back to the theoretical stuff. So we have this argument out here about why states take the positions they do. And I think just to kind of wrap that part up is to think about, so how does that work? There's a way in which, so if you started here in either case, and we can use I want to maybe just walk through the LURTAP case to watch how this changes over time, because what's important is that early on in any negotiation, where are most countries? They're probably either bystanders. They don't think they're very vulnerable, right? We don't care about the problem. And they're sort of, they're largely driven by this, right? Initially, they're just driven by this parameter, right? When an environmental problem is just coming up, just getting on the agenda, states don't think they're very vulnerable to this problem. Only as the science starts coming in, do countries start moving this way. What on average tends to happen with abatement costs over time? And I think there could work both ways, but
If it's lower as technology improves.
okay, so one effect is that over time we improve technology, especially if it's pushed, right? If people see some regulation coming down the road, they're going to start developing new technologies. So in some sense, it tends to push that way. Okay, what's the
Goes up because the problem just gets getting bigger.
Okay, but there may be a growing sense of how much you have to do to get there. So there's a sort of countervailing arrow this way, right? So what is it? Go.
Over time, market incentives might push companies to create sort of like sustainable products or cleaner products, so the costs would go down to make those changes because they're actually getting higher value for the product.
Okay, so what's great here, what's really fabulous here, is thinking about this abatement cost argument. Competing theories about it, right? And we don't know whether Emily's argument about the market works, right? I mean, she's in her systems, but she could be from economics as far as what she just said, right? I mean, the market works, get the government out of the market, just markets are fabulous things. On the one hand, and what was the argument pushing the other way? Sorry, I've just lost it.
Pollution gets worse.
Oh, that the problem gets bigger and bigger, and it doesn't matter about cost per unit, right? Countries don't worry about cost per unit, they care about cost. How much is it going to cost me to fix this problem? And so we would expect that as the problem gets bigger, abatement costs go up. So it tends to push states, towards dragging more. Okay, and we might be concerned about, do these move in? Which of these is a more powerful factor, right? But also from a policy point of view, you just started an NGO. What does this, just setting out this theory, make you think about? You're an NGO that wants to. You're an NGO that wants to get a treaty signed on excessive fixing of nitrogen and phosphorus in the soils. Okay, growing problem, not much known about it yet, but we know that all the fertilizers we're shoving into the, we're taking oil wells, turning them into fertilizer, and putting it into the soil, right? And so we're fixing a lot of nitrogen, a lot of phosphorus in the soils. And you think, God, and you know enough about it. You've been a scientist for the last 10 years, and you're a scientist at Harvard, and you've done this study and you show here's all the big problems with it, and you just got it accepted at Science, right? So this article is going to come out, and now you want to set up an NGO to fix this problem. So what does just this theory start saying to you about? Okay, we have a theory about how negotiations succeed, what leads them to succeed. What does your NGO do? You're going to take, you also had one of these MacArthur Genius Awards like Schneider did, right? So you got 10 what, I don't know how much it is, you got a chunk of change, right, that you're going to start this NGO out with. What are the bylaws of this NGO that they should do what?
We should make a case for a cost-effective means of changing the problem.
Oh, okay. Make a case for a cost, meaning what?
Okay, so the U.S. has to, we're in a treaty situation. The U.S. has to decrease the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus that's entering the soil. The NGO is going to approach companies that are, say it's industrial waste treatment, or say it's farmers or whatever. They need to not just say, okay, this is a great idea, we should do it for the benefit of the planet. Then you say, here's how you can do it.
Okay.
Here's how it's cost effective. Like if you just do this, you're actually saving money in nitrogen inputs because more of the fertilizer is actually going on the plants.
Okay. Okay, so one is just technology research, right? Okay. Technology R&D. Go out and find some alternative, right? That's one way to get people. If one of the things that keeps people to be draggers or intermediates is that the costs are high, right? Then to the extent that we can push costs down, we can do that. So why not spend $5 million, design, in other words, if we want to get better success on the climate change negotiations, go figure out a way you can sell, you can get PVCs, photovoltaic cells, right, as opposed to PCBs. Photovoltaics for a nickel a pop, and each one creates a kilowatt hour of energy all day long, even up in Oregon where it rains all the time, right? I mean, that you want some technology that says, hey, you can do this, and it's cheap, right? Switch over, it's cheap, okay? So one way is to do that. What are some other strategies? Because these are some that we see. What's Schneider's approach? He's learned the lesson of this theory. What is it? This one, right? Increase people's view that they're vulnerable. Raise the awareness that when climate change happens, your city's going to be under, when he fed that information that got misused from the, the map of the world that was all red, the map of the US that was all red, right? And it doesn't matter whether you're really increasing vulnerability, just increase the perception of it. It doesn't matter whether it's true or not, right? There may be long-term effects of the impartiality of that, right? That was what Steve was pushing, was he's saying, hey, I don't like being misquoted in order to push a perception of vulnerability. That's not true. but the bottom line is you need to increase the perception that you're vulnerable. Okay? So I think there's a way to think about this process by which, how do we get, if everybody's pushers, we got no problem, right? And that's what you want to do, is get everybody pushing to coordinate their behavior to fix the climate change problem. So I think one way to kind of do it is to kind of walk through the LRTAP negotiations, okay, the long-range transboundary air pollution, which has been, I mean, in basic terms, a pretty successful regime, okay? And it is a regime in the sense that the LRTAP case is not just a treaty. There was an initial treaty in 1979, but it's had an ongoing kind of effect on in addressing acid rain. In March of '83, basically the Scandinavian countries, Finland, Norway, and Sweden, proposed a protocol, okay, to reduce emissions by 30% from 1980 baseline by the year '93. Okay, so that starts out. And then you see Germany, right shortly thereafter, Germany, Swiss, and Austrians make a proposal for the best available technology, BAT, that's economically feasible. So they start saying, well, we're willing to kind of buy on if our abatement costs aren't too high, right? You have to kind of limit our vulnerability to high abatement costs. And then you have this process in Munich and Ottawa during '84 in which there's these sort of high-level rallies, essentially, bringing the countries together and pressuring them to join Finland and Norway and Sweden to kind of join this 30% club. Okay? So here was a case, interesting case, where these states sort of said, we're going to do this anyway. Okay? We're going to move forward anyway. We're going to commit to doing a 30% reduction, whether everybody else does or not. And in June of '83, there's like 9 supporters. By March of '84, there's 11. By June of '84, there's 18. And by December of '84, there's 20 countries that are supporting this proposal. And so in a little over a year, 11 different governments have changed their minds about this proposal, have switched sides. And I think it sort of raises a bunch of different elements. One is that you did have countries that were pushers, which were, they saw themselves as very vulnerable. Okay, the Scandinavian countries were taking a lot of acid rain from England, right? They were basically downwind. And their abatement costs were low because they weren't producing much of it, right? Again, okay, so is this a tragedy of the commons? I want to I keep pushing this. This is not a tragedy of the commons here, at least this aspect of it, right? What is it? It's an upstream-downstream problem, right? You got victims and perpetrators, right? And so one of the things is if you have a kind of upstream-downstream problem, here's the victims, right? And here's the perpetrators, right? The British say, we got a solution to this problem, to the acid rain problem. In fact, the reason why the Scandinavians had such a big acid rain problem was because the Brits had solved their acid rain problem. What did they do? Make taller smokestacks, right? So that they got all the acid rain up high enough that it never fell on British soil. I mean, literally, that is what they did. It went downwind. Okay, so just just pollute thy neighbor sort of approach to to politics. So I think that's an important kind of thing to keep clear. And notice that the kind of resistance to negotiation is a lot stronger in that case. So the Brits. Poland and Spain, which were major polluting countries, didn't sign it, and kept negotiating and resisting, etc., over time. The other important element here is is thinking about how these environmental problems are not just one-offs, right? They're not just in this little political vacuum, right? So a lot of what happened in the LRTAP negotiation, a lot of the story that Mark Levy tells in probably one of the more cited pieces on it, is a story in which a lot of the kind of Soviet states, the Soviet bloc states, Eastern European states, signed on because of détente. This is during the, during the 70s and 80s, sort of a kind of Cold War. It was one area where we could cooperate with the West, right? And that hey, it's low cost, it doesn't matter much. They were going to solve their problem by just moving a bunch of factories and power plants sort of east of the Urals, kind of get it out of Europe and solve the problems that way. So it was not going to be very expensive for them to comply. And there were big PR benefits and sort of political benefits in terms of having some kind of interaction with the West on this. And I think another important issue is the role, and this is one where LURTAP has, it really fits in a lot of ways with Haas's model about epistemic communities. That science played a really important role here, and but it was a role that was played over time, so that you had the first step, the first protocol, in fact, is not a regulatory protocol. The first protocol to LURTAP is for EMAP, the European Monitoring and, I forget what it stands for, but European Monitoring and Evaluation Program. But basically saying, wait a minute, you got the Germans measuring, and I'm sure I don't have the facts anywhere close to right, so I'm making this up, but something like the Germans are measuring the amount of acid rain by measuring the amount of sulfur dioxide that falls over a square meter during a 3-month period. Okay, that's how they're measuring it. And the Scandinavians are measuring it by looking at the amount of nitrogen that's fixing in a hectare of soil over a year. And the Poles are measuring it by measuring the daily dose of some other chemical. Right? And so the first thing you got to do is coordinate the damn strategies of scientific research and say, okay, let's all measure in metric units. Even the US has to do that. Okay? Measure in metric units, measure the same chemicals, measure them over the same periods of time, basically standardize the process so we start to understand the problem. To say, let's all start doing this jointly. But that itself requires coordination. Who's going to resist that?
Anyone has to change.
Anybody who has to change. If the USGS has to redo all their maps so that they're not measured in feet, right? So that all those guys out in the Sierras get lost because they're getting, haste and hate from, thinking it's 1,000, it's 5,000 feet when it's actually 5,000 meters, right? We know there's a problem there. A lot of people are going to have to, change their behavior. So anybody who has to change to coordinate, not that everybody doesn't think it's better to coordinate, right? The standard coordination problem is the coordination problem of speaking the same language that you want. That in order to avoid airplane crashes, you have to have one language that everybody speaks between the plane and the control tower. And you don't want people coming in and flying into JFK and saying, je ne parle pas anglais, right? You don't want people who can't talk English to the control. So in every country in the world, every air traffic control person must talk English. And every pilot must talk English. Okay? So now who resisted that? Everybody whose first language wasn't English, right? Because they all had to switch over to this one chord. Did everybody want that to happen? Sure. They just wanted it to happen so that we all spoke Swahili when we flew in, or we all spoke French, or whatever it was, right? So these coordination problems, everybody wants to do it, but nobody wants to do it that way. So there's still problems there, but relatively small, because once they say English, then it goes to this issue that Kim raised, is the very fact of, as long as you say English, then everybody knows, do English, right? It's not like if you're going to flight school and you know that the international rule is you have to know English, you don't say, oh, well, I'm just going to be, I don't want to learn English, right? You bitch and moan, but you learn English, right? You just make sure you coordinate that way because that's the way it's going to happen. So part of this process was this process of getting scientists on board. And it's not merely the process of having them coordinate and having them all measure in grams and square kilometers and stuff like that. But it's also a process of discussion, of coordinating about thinking about what are the various, having annual meetings where you get together and say, what are the problems? What are you seeing in your country about what is, wow, you come in with really high levels of nitrogen. What's happening? What does it look like when you go to that forest? Is it dead? I mean, that was a lot of what happened in there's even a German word for it, which I can't pronounce, but basically forest die-off. That they saw the forest dying, and they said, hey, we got to solve this problem. I mean, the Germans were initially, if I recall correctly, were caught in this high abatement cost but high vulnerability, kind of intermediate, because they were kind of both perpetrators and victims of this problem. So you have this sort of convergence on a common sensibility about what the science is, about what the facts are, about what's happening. And then, and one of the advantages of this is not merely this process of standardization, but over time, you had these scientists gain power within their own governments. Why? Because if you're being invited to international meetings, all of a sudden your stature starts going up, right? If people find out that you're the person who people invite to go to these international meetings, your government all of a sudden starts calling you up and saying, what the hell's going on over there? And how do we avoid getting, hurt by this at some future point in time? And I think one of the interesting issues, the way Mark Levy describes it, when LERTAP was created, only 2 of its 30 members thought acid rain was a serious environmental problem. So you already had the creation of something to deal with something that most people didn't think was a problem. And now, now everybody does. All the countries there know acid rain is a problem. So there's then this huge sea change. And they're not only, they think it's a problem, but they're trying ambitious regulatory processes. The institutions, so LERTAP and it had very close relationships with IASA, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, which the Russians were involved in Vienna, went through this process, this institutional process of promoting science. That altered states' perceptions of their vulnerability, right? So that you had scientists learn the science, go back to their home countries, convince their governments that we got a problem here. So it helped move ecological vulnerability down, so pushing bystanders to become pushers and draggers to become intermediates, right? It was what happened was Germany was a dragger until it learned that there was a problem and became an intermediate, right? So you have this movement towards that. And so that's this changing of, that's what's leading states to change positions. And then the other part to realize is that it's not just science, that the politics drive it too. Because when you look at this 30% club, right? What was 30%? That come from a bunch of scientists saying to avoid all the problems of acid rain, reduce to 30% from 1980 levels. That's a nice safe level. No, it's like the 5% with climate change. It's what can happen, and it's 30%. Certainly from an environmental perspective, 30% is not the right number because you'd want to. You probably don't worry too much about the UK factories because most of that land's over water. You worry more about the French factories. They're nuclear, so it doesn't matter. But you worry about the French factories or the ones that are damaging land, unless you think there's a problem with ocean, with ocean acidification. Okay, so you're trying to say, work on the areas that are the worst, right? Work on the areas that are the worst emitters. Work on those first. From an ecological perspective, that's what you want to do. It's the same issue in the whaling case. In the whaling case, you had a commercial moratorium. What's wrong with a commercial moratorium from an environmental perspective? It was a moratorium on all killing of whales for commercial reasons. But you can still do scientific whaling and aboriginal whalings. What's the problem with that from an environmental perspective? You think the whales care what happens to them after they're killed? Right. It doesn't matter whether they're sold in a market, eaten by an aboriginal, or used, or laid out on a lab desk in a science laboratory, right? Makes no difference whatsoever to how many whales there are in the system, right? But you had a across-the-board thing that was for commercial, and it was across all species. But all species were not threatened equally. It's a nice, easy rule to write. Makes no sense ecologically, but it's easier to negotiate than to negotiate for this species we have this level, and for this species we have that level, etc. Yeah, Kim.
It could be that they were thinking just that businesses or the commercial sector would be more likely to exacerbate the problem of the tragedy of commons more so than scientists.
Yes, yeah, no, that was true. But the question is then why not let them? that's certainly true. And so what you're doing is, but it's not a scientific reason. It's political, or it's a kind of social reason. And that, so I just kind of pose a counterpoint to thinking, okay, science runs the world, and it doesn't. You know, that negotiation reflects science, but they also reflect politics and social structures and how we do this regulation. I mean, certainly the more plausible argument would have been to say, shouldn't we allow them, countries that want a whale, to kill certain whales that weren't threatened, that weren't near extinction, right? There were some whale populations that were not close to extinction. And certainly once they are, you know, they become out, they're no longer threatened, we should let countries whale. That would be the scientific perspective. If we buy into, notice this is another part of Peter Haas's argument. He talks about a kind of a common set of norms and values, right? That one of the issues in the whaling case, we'll talk about this next week, is this notion of the, I forget what his name was, the Whaling Commission's the chair of the scientific committee walked off in a huff. I mean, quit, resigned, because he had said, hey, here's how many whales you can kill each year, right? And the politics said, we're not going to allow you to, right? The politicians said, no whaling, right? I mean, there's values involved in that. Scientists thought, if I say you can, that means you should, right? There's a value statement embedded in the notion that you should be able to kill whales, and it's a value statement that a lot of other people disagree with. No, there's not any terms under which you should kill whales, right? And so science is embedded with certain values that not everybody accepts, right? I mean, the scientists can tell us how many you could kill without threatening the species, right? They can tell you the recruitment rate is 4%, so if you take 0.5%, it won't threaten the species and it'll still grow. But that doesn't tell you anything about whether you should or not. It just tells you that if you were to do that, this would be the consequence, but it doesn't tell you anything about the morality of engaging in that act. And I think one of the kind of interesting things about the LRTAP case is you didn't see, what you saw was a sort of a change in interests, changing positions, you know, and changing behaviors. That you didn't, that a lot of the argument in the LRTAP case is not one about that you set up some rules and then the countries change their behaviors. What happened was you changed their interests, that led to them changing their rules, and also led them to change their behavior. And the rules were almost a codification of what they were planning to do. So you actually don't see much impact of the rules themselves, but it's an impact of the process that led up to the rules and also led to states reducing their acid emissions, okay? So that's one part of it. Then I want to kind of go on in the last 10 minutes is to think, kind of think about different general strategies of negotiation. So you see one here, which was sort of a few countries getting together and sort of building up over time. Another case you see this is in the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands. The same thing, a bunch of countries that were concerned about birds, you know, having access to viable wetlands, getting together. Started in '71. There were about 20, 30 countries involved then, and it's now at about 130 countries. You know, so that over time it's built up credibility, understanding, membership, etc. So these processes, as opposed to ones like what happened in Rio, right? In 1992 at the UNCED conference in Rio, what happened there is get everybody together. Doesn't matter if you're part of the problem, you're part of the solution. Just throw everybody in a room and negotiate, right, on all these problems. Now, one of the issues is, if you think about that, I mean, what are some of the issues that get raised when you think about that? So we had, out of Rio, we had, I think, you had the Biological Diversity Convention, the Climate Change Convention, and sort of shortly thereafter the Desertification Convention, all three of which were major ones. You also had an attempt at a Deforestation Convention, which didn't happen, right? It wasn't signed. There were some forestry principles signed, but there was not a treaty signed. And in those three, you have 150, 160, 170, 180 countries signed on. What's the problem with that approach? How much time do you think those countries thought about how much is this going to cost us? Is this in our interests? Should we do it? Will we follow through? You know, how much thought do you? Not much, right? I mean, every good PR, man. I mean, it would have been silly. I mean, Malaysia was silly. for very vociferously and very vocally saying, we're not going to sign these forestry principles. It was shortchanged. What was the cost of just signing them, going along, and not doing anything? Nobody else is doing anything on any of these on any of these treaties, right? Nobody else is changing their behavior in response to it. So why not get the PR points for signing it? It's not like somebody's going to beat you up if you don't comply, right? So I mean, you think about these processes. But let's pose. Let me just lay out kind of 4 different sort of types of treaties, and then I want to go through kind of 2 different things for climate change. And one is a treaty with kind of you have amendments as required, right? You just have a treaty that sets up the basic framework, that lays out some initial rules, and you say we might get these wrong, so we'll amend it later. That's fine. That's been the standard initially. Then you can have a treaty with an appendix for annual reevaluation. So the whaling treaty is a very short treaty that has some general language, and then it has what's called the schedule, basically an appendix that says here's the rules this year. And they met every year, changed the rules every year to saying that you can kill this many whales this year. Okay, next year you can kill that many whales. And each year they would revise the schedule as to how many whales. Most of the fisheries agreements, those of you who are doing the fisheries agreement, say, well, we've got this interactive process. We have to see what the effect of our behavior is each year. It's a very fast-changing process. A third one is the Convention and Protocol. This is the one that the Montreal Protocol has put together. You have an agreement about a topic, and you negotiate what you can on the first round, and then you proceed from there. So in the LURTAP case, you had this initial pretty vague convention on long-range transboundary air pollution. Over time, they've had 8 protocols. The first one was on sulfur. The second one was on nitrogen oxides. The third was on volatile organic compounds. The fourth one, I think, was a second one on sulfur dioxides, which got rid of the 30% and said, let's do critical loads, okay, as sort of a more scientifically based approach. The fifth one was on heavy metals. Then there's 3 others that have been signed at this point. Persistent organic pollutants, et cetera. Okay, so they've just kept saying, okay, let's just keep broadening our purview. The Marine Pollution Convention is the same thing. They had 5 appendices, on different pollutants, plastics, oil, chemicals, noxious compounds, et cetera. So they've just continued adding new amendments or protocols and stuff like that, changing it over time. And then you can have a variety of sort of an ongoing negotiation where you spin off different agreements every few years. Okay, the GATT and World Trade Organization are a typical example of that, right? Where you have the Uruguay round, the Tokyo round, the Kennedy round, right? So they just come up with agreements every 5, 10 years, whatever. You have some of those in environmentally. The Berne Convention is one in which they're sort of trying to get different conventions signed. So it's a convention to say, we'll try to sign conventions on a variety of different problems, and they sign treaties that way. Now let's just, in the case of climate change, think about a couple of 2 choices. Okay, I'll give you 2 pairs of choices. The first is the problem about linkage. Okay, few gases, single or comprehensive. Should we have a single agreement on CO2 or a comprehensive agreement on all 6 gases? Okay, there's 6 major gases involved in climate change. Which should you do? How do you think about this question, Eli?
First, I think it depends. If you're gonna limit one, then it's probably going to be a larger sort of decrease, or you could do like a smaller decrease in all 6, which might be fine.
Okay, so one for the same environmental impact. If you're only going to do one, you better do that one right. Okay. Let's just kind of, okay, so other issues. So one is, if you're only going to do one, you're leaving the other 5 creating the problem, going on about you've got a business as usual scenario for them. And so if you're going to if you're worried about environmental effectiveness, you better be making deep cuts in that first one. What does that say about the negotiation process? Probably harder, right? If you're going to say, well, we got to do it deeper, right? Especially if you think of, can I get a 30% reduction in one chemical, forgetting which chemical it is, right? Can I get a 30% reduction in one chemical? Is that harder to get than a 5% reduction across 6 different chemicals? Again, just assuming they were all kind of equal. Well, the first 5% is probably easy, right, for almost any chemical. But getting 30%, that's a big change, right? 5% is just kind of waste, fraud, and abuse sorts of stuff out of the system. But if you're going to do a 30, So one is if you go to a single thing, you're going to have to push harder at least if you're going to achieve the same environmental effectiveness. So that's going to make the negotiations harder. What other elements? Any ways it makes it easier, Emily, or other ways it makes it harder?
I was going to say for abatement costs, it might be if factories have to revamp their smokestacks or whatever, it might be easier to do a comprehensive agreement where, while they're putting the money into, restructuring their factories or whatever, they probably can put in different things for the different components that they're emitting. So it might be easier to push the agenda because I think the abatement costs would be cheaper and comprehensive.
Okay. So in one sense, if you're gonna get rid of a bad old factory, you don't want to replace it with one that has 5 of the same problems but not the 6th one, right? Okay. Eli?
Depending on how you're going to sort of structure compliance into it, you're going to have a lot more cost trying to monitor 5 different chemicals than just monitoring one chemical too.
So that's another issue, is the monitoring. What about on the negotiation front? What's an advantage of having 6?
You get all excited and say, look at what they're doing.
Okay, good PR. But how does it make it, if all of you are, 12 countries, 15 countries sitting around the table, and we're doing 6 different ones, what's one of the advantages of doing 6?
Maybe it'll be easier for some countries to cut down more on certain ones and less on others.
Very good. So there's trade-offs that can be made, so that if you're all, we have to make some certain assumptions, but if you're all equally committed to working this problem, right, then it's going to be easier for you in China to reduce sulfur than it is to reduce CO2, right? Because you have a lot of coal, so you want to burn the coal, but you can do that in a clean way if you get some technology transfer from the U.S. or whatever. And so there's going to be these trade-offs, so that the U.S. or equally, if we're distributing costs, if we just do CO2, a lot of countries get off pretty light, because they don't produce a lot of CO2. Countries that we would want to bring on. Whereas if we also include methane. If we include just taking 2 chemicals, CO2, carbon dioxide, and methane, the methane basically is predominantly, kind of on average, more produced by developing countries because it's produced by rice paddies and cows and stuff like that, right? And CO2 is usually by the industrial countries right now. And so we can make trade-offs between, you do your part, we'll do ours. We say, we don't care how you get there, just do both, You can do it with CO2 or CH4, but you have to do it. You have to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions by X%. Then you can have people choose. Go back to Emily's point. You let the market work a little bit. And let people choose the cheapest way for them to do it. Okay. But the other problem is that once you do that, you also and Jim Sabinius has written a lot about these blocking coalitions. What happens as soon as you start regulating 6 different chemicals? Well, if you go back to our earlier point that if the reason why this is important is because industry resists, right? If the reason why you're a dragger here is because industry is resistant to the abatement costs, you don't want to go out and get all the different industries all pissed off at once, right? This is not a good idea. You want to piss them off one at a time, right? Because you want most industries to be bystanders, right? The more bystander industries you have, it's easier to resist one dragger at a time, sort of divide and conquer. Don't kind of get the companies that produce a lot of methane in their production process and CO2 and nitrogen oxides and all the other things, ammonia and CFCs, all of them pissed off at you all at once. Not a good idea, because then for sure you're going to lose this war, this domestic political war of getting it through. Okay, so that's one thing. Then just kind of a last point is just to think about, on the other, this thing that we talked about in the LURTAP case, few actors or universal. Which is better? With few actors, easier to come to agreement, less good environmentally because only Scandinavia is doing it, less impact counterfactually because those countries would have done it anyway. And so you want to kind of just think about, but do you want to, if you have a few, can you bring in others over time? That seems to be what happened in the LURTAP case. In the climate change case, we're doing exactly the opposite of that, right? We're saying, and the U.S. is very explicitly saying, no, you're all on board now, or this train ain't leaving the station, right? That's the strategy we have there.
unclear which is a better strategy, right? And especially if you said, let's measure the effects on pollution, maybe we get everybody on board. And then it goes, it takes a while to get them on board, but once they're on board, we move faster, right? And I mean, so that I think you have to think about this process of doing a little now, doing the little you can now. This is Schneider's argument. It may have good value, but the other sort of one lesson would be the Limited Test Ban Treaty signed in 1963 by Kennedy, right? The Limited Test Ban Treaty said you can continue to test nuclear weapons, just you can't do it above ground. You have to do it underground. You have to dig big holes. And it was another 30 years before you got a comprehensive test ban treaty. And would it have been better if he'd held out for 3 more years, and hopefully hadn't been shot in the process, right? But if he'd held out for 3 more years and be able to get a comprehensive test ban treaty in 1966, that would have saved us 30 years of nuclear weapons going through 4, 5, 6 changes of process. But could he have gotten one in 66? That's the counterfactual. We don't know, right? If he'd held out, would it just meant no treaty for 30 years rather than a partial treaty? There's not good answers to these, but I think they're questions you want to think about as you think about how do negotiations succeed, what helps them succeed, what helps cause them to fail.